its summit with Putin last year. Do you think that that particular concession has in any way stopped the Russians from ramping up their efforts, or actually has it emboldened them?
I think Russians, they precisely read and follow the situation of the US president. United States need to invest a lot of money in internal resilience of its system, social care, environmental system, so on and so forth. And Russians, they precisely know the situation of the US president. And I think they can perceive a kind of weakness of the President Biden. I only hope that they are mistaken.
Well, America seems to be talking tough that they would introduce heavy financial sanctions against Russia should it move into Ukraine. But you think that that talk is really enough? Because what seems to be really needed is to attack Russia's interests in energy and also to attack the oligarchs' financial interests.
The thing is that the deterrents need to be credible. And of course, to force Germany to stop Nord Stream 2 would be a credible deterrent. But again, let me reiterate that Poland is NATO, Czech Republic is NATO, Baltic States is NATO. So, for instance, I don't know what is the now current situation with Polish army, but I can tell you that I really encourage our government already now need to start some moving. And of course, for instance, the electronic warfare unit in Lithuania. So this is a very tangible unit. I think we should already now increase readiness of our units, for instance, to put some units on alert, to start some, let's say, internal movement, to freeze our, let's say, inspections of Russians in our barracks and so on and so forth. So we can do already movement now.
Yeah.
We need to support the Americans.
Yeah. Isn't the problem that the West is now so defensive on Belarus, on Ukraine, on Kazakhstan, constantly in retreat, never actually saying what it really wants to do and what it has the confidence to do? Is that because it doesn't have the unity or doesn't have the will, or what?
I agree with you. As I said, 2 days ago, Mr. Borrell from EU, he said his disappointment that he's not part of the negotiation with Russians. But I think if European Union would be ready to back its position with as really a tangible threat of really tough sanctions, sectoral sanctions, it can have a meaning because, the majority of Russian trade is with European Union. If European Union really needed or wanted to use this as a threat, its economic power, it can have a really meaning. But without this, I agree with you. We are, I think, not tough enough, and we are not ready to provide a really strategic answer to the Russian coercive policy.
So is your fear now that the days of NATO enlargement or color revolutions in the East are now well and truly over, and that Russia is on the offensive?
Last, let's say, 2-3 years, especially United States or Great Britain, did a lot of military cooperation with the Ukraine. So they did also training, they provided some weaponry. So there are also other, let's say, possibility how to back up Ukraine. I still think that the promise of the Bucharest Summit 2008 should be in place vis-à-vis Georgia and vis-à-vis Ukraine, clear. But in practical terms, we have different also mean to back those countries.
But of course, those promises are not going forward at this particular stage. Martin Swarovski, thank you very much for joining us here on World Today.
Thank you for your invitation. Goodbye.
Thank you. Russia is being treated as a superpower, which is actually part of what it has wanted to achieve. Meanwhile, on the health security front, the British and the French are now adopting radically different approaches to living with the COVID virus.
Countries around the world have had to struggle in equal measure with dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but now leaders are expressing drastically different ways of approaching how they will deal with it going forward. One of the most striking differences can be seen between Great Britain and France. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is drawing up plans for a living with COVID strategy that will be in place as of March this year and aims to avoid long-term restrictions. The former chairman of the UK's vaccine task force has openly stated that COVID should be treated as an endemic virus similar to flu, and ministers should end mass vaccination after the booster campaign. He underlined a need to return to a new normality. In stark contrast to this is French President Emmanuel Macron, who is standing by his hardline vaccination strategy and his earlier comments that he wanted to piss off the unvaccinated, whom he classified as non-citizens. More than 100,000 anti-vaccine protesters rallied over the weekend against the tightening curbs on their civil liberties. More than 40,000 people also protested in the Austrian capital Vienna, where vaccination against COVID-19 is set to become compulsory from next month. In Germany, protesters also rallied in several cities as the country considers imposing a general vaccine mandate. Protests also took place in Italy, with hundreds of people in the city of Turin protesting against rules that make vaccines mandatory for anyone above the age of 50. As of Monday, in Italy, those who are unvaccinated can no longer use public transport or visit restaurants. Meanwhile, the Czech Republic is easing restrictions and will allow critical workers such as doctors and teachers to go to work after a positive COVID-19 test. As the much more contagious but less severe Omicron variant becomes dominant and forces hundreds of thousands to isolate, the pressure is growing on health workers, police, firefighters, and teachers.
Macron and Johnson have clashed repeatedly over fishing rights, migrants crossing the Channel, and the Northern Ireland Protocol of the Brexit Agreement. And they have now adopted very different strategies for coping with COVID. Here to assess the differences in coping with COVID for the future, we have Dr. Alan Green from the Birmingham Law School. Welcome to World Today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, is the difference in approaches between Johnson and Macron a result of the fact that they're playing to rather different political galleries at a different moment in the political cycle in both countries?
So I think the difference perhaps goes back deeper than that. For the entirety of this pandemic, the UK has taken a very, I suppose, reluctant approach to taking measures to control the pandemic. It was one of the last countries in Europe to lock down, and we had a recent report produced by parliamentary committees criticising the UK's reluctance to shut down. It's also been one of the first countries then to try and lift restrictions as soon as possible. So, and then it's moved towards, particularly at the start of 2021, a very, very fast drive to get vaccines into people's arms in order to try and avoid any kind of lockdown measures in future. So the UK government's, I suppose, reluctance to lockdown goes back basically to the very beginning of the pandemic, in contrast to France, which had, I suppose, quite forceful measures. Now, whether that we're still seeing that as a result of election pressures, we see Macron obviously has an election coming up in April this year, while the UK, on the face of it, looks like there's not an election coming up anytime soon. Nevertheless, the peculiarities of the UK constitutional system means that an election can pretty much happen whenever the government loses the confidence of Parliament. And if you've been following UK news closely, Boris Johnson's currently under quite a lot of pressure over parties in 10 Downing Street that potentially breached COVID regulations. So it's quite possible that the UK is not as far away from an election as it might look like on paper.
Indeed, and that is indeed my point, that he is playing to a different gallery. And that gallery actually is the Conservative Party, where most of the MPs are very, very opposed to further lockdowns and more restrictions on people's freedoms.
Yes, that's certainly the case. That the pressures on the government from an anti-lockdown perspective are actually coming from within the government's own party. So the more restrictive measures that were introduced in December, for instance, the introduction of COVID passes, only passed with the support of the opposition Labour Party. So Boris Johnson is controlled and is constrained by this anti-lockdown, some would call it a libertarian wing of his political party that's not necessarily seen perhaps in Macron's France.
But is not the attitude that Johnson is taking here more unifying in terms of Britain as a whole than is Macron in France, who seems to be dividing the country between those who are vaccinated and those who are unvaccinated, and is openly saying, I want to piss off the unvaccinated. I want to make them angry. And of course, angry they do get, and they get out on the streets and protest. There don't seem to be many protests in the United Kingdom at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm not sure whether it's a more unifying approach. Certainly, you'll actually see that public support for more stringent lockdown measures tend to be more prevalent in polls. And his approach to the pandemic in the UK has certainly been quite polarizing. The fact that he's reliant on opposition support to get his measures across suggests that actually the divide is really within his party, as distinct from public support as a whole. In terms of Macron's move, that his term to piss off people who haven't got a vaccine yet, I think that's more, I suppose he's kind of running out of patience with people who have not gotten a vaccination yet. Essentially, if you would have gotten it by now if you weren't skeptical of it. And I suppose it's a way of trying to increase political pressures on people without actually making the move to make vaccinations compulsory, which we have seen in other European countries. Incidentally, Boris Johnson and the UK government have made COVID vaccinations compulsory for frontline NHS staff. That's coming into play on the 1st of April. So I'm not sure whether on the issue of vaccines in particular, whether the two are actually as far apart as it might appear in terms of their rhetoric. But certainly you could look at Macron's language and say he's using this strong language as a last resort before potentially introducing compulsory measures, which suggest he's reluctant to do.
But of course, the French are also making those who are unvaccinated literally stay at home. They're being kept out of places of work, restaurants, cafes, public transport, and so on. Now, none of that is happening in the United Kingdom, is it?
Well, the UK did bring in COVID passes in December, so requirement of proof of vaccination, or I think recent recovery from COVID as well, in order to get into certain large-scale events.
But now there's talk of that being lifted. There's now talk that soon all that's going to disappear.
Potentially, yes, but in light of rising case numbers at the moment, I don't see it happening anytime in the near future. We have quite substantial pressures on hospitals and case numbers.
Are there really signs that the health services in the United Kingdom or anywhere else at the moment in Europe are being overrun? It seems that with these latest waves, and certainly with the Omicron wave, actually the numbers of hospitalizations and deaths is lower.
So certainly the death toll is lower, and that's great. And we are seeing a break, arguably, between infections and rates of hospitalization. But nevertheless, those rates are incredibly high. We've seen an almost 50% increase in both death rates and hospitalizations in the UK in the past week alone. As I've mentioned, we're seeing suggestions of the need to deploy the army to assist with some hospitals in London. So this is down not just to the numbers of people in hospital, but also the number of staff that are off sick and needing to self-isolate.
But is not the instinct of Johnson and other people too, that after 2 years of the COVID pandemic, the government has delivered on vaccines, there are drugs available, there are treatments available, and really the people everywhere need to start to live with this particular virus and to be able to carry on life as normal, because really the economies and societies can't take any more lockdowns.
So again, that's been Boris Johnson's policy arguably since the very, very start, hence his reluctance to lock down. So that's not necessarily a change in policy. I do think certainly we're hopefully, fingers crossed, we're seeing the end of the pandemic now with this potentially less virulent strain. But at the same time, when we talk about lockdowns and we talk about the impact that the pandemic has on people's lives and, say, people's rights, very often we frame those measures as only impacting and harming people's human rights. But what we also need to think about is actually those measures protect human rights, most importantly being the right to life, and particularly the right to life of very, very vulnerable people too. So there are strong arguments in favour of those lockdown measures too. Yeah. And if you look at the statistics, that the primary, cause of this surge is in the unvaccinated people. So until we get enough jabs into people's arms, those measures are going to be required. So so it's the unvaccinated that are suffering actually when they get infected, because they but in a way, isn't that again a question of personal responsibility? If you don't vaccinate, then in a way you are doing yourself harm. And can the state really try and protect you by making you vaccinate? Is that the right approach? So I do think you're correct that it is a personal choice, but as we've seen from the pandemic and from the idea of public health, that your personal choice impacts upon other people and that you might pass it on to other people. In terms of mandatory vaccinations, now I'm certainly not one to advocate that. I think really the best way to get people vaccinated is to get them to trust officials, trust society, trust doctors, and compulsory measures might be counterproductive in that regard.
Trusted public officials, of course, is a whole separate issue and one that we will no doubt be returning to in future programs. Alan Green, thank you very much for joining us here on World Today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. COVID stopped the British from going to pubs for a while, but now in one part of Britain, a row has broken out about renaming a pub which is called the Black Bitch.
Local activists are trying to stop the name of a historic pub being changed because its brewery owners claim it is racially offensive. The pub in question is the Black Bitch in Linlithgow, Scotland, and the brewery Green King, who have publicly apologized for its founders' links to the slave trade, have already changed the names of two of their pubs that were called Black Boy and Black's Head. Locals want no change, as the name Black Bitch is of a black female greyhound, which forms a part of the Burr's coat of arms and is commemorated by a statue in the town's high street. Legend has it that a black female greyhound would swim across Linlithgow Loch to bring food to her master, who was sentenced to starve to death on an island. The town and its residents are steeped in the tale, which dates back to the 13th century, with it being used in primary schools to teach children about loyalty. The Green King Brewery has suggested the name Black Hound for the pub, which will probably still displease some and please no one.
Identity politics gone mad. No controversy about the name of our program as our time draws to a close. World Today is back on tap with more stories tomorrow. Stay with us here on TVP World.
The World Health Organization stated that cases of Omicron have already been detected in almost all European and Central Asian countries.
It is quickly becoming the dominant virus in Western Europe and is now spreading into the Balkans. At this rate, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation forecasts that more than 50% of the population in the region will be infected with Omicron in the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Omicron is about 2 to 3 times more contagious than the previous Delta variant. It has mostly milder symptoms, but because of the high infectiousness, it presents a challenge to the health services. Hospitalization rates are now on the rise in Europe.
Keeping schools open has important benefits for children's mental, social and educational well-being. Schools should be the last places to close and the first to reopen.
Kluge has also urged European countries to keep their schools open despite the rapid spread of the virus. WHO also adds that even the vaccinated can get infected with Omicron, but vaccination proves to be effective in preventing severe illness and hospitalizations.
A marble fragment showing the foot of the seated ancient Greek goddess Artemis returned from the Antonius Salanus Archaeological Museum in Palermo to the Acropolis Museum in Athens. It's a part of Sicily's 4-year cultural heritage agreement that will make exchanges of artifacts between museums possible.
It is a marvelous way that the Sicilian friends and the Italian friends thought about to bring it back where it was born.
Antonius Salanus Museum Director Caterina Greco, by this act, wants to encourage other museums to return the monuments of Hellenistic culture to their native place.
We, as Sicily, have the will to give back the fragments to the Parthenon and to Greece. We are not sending a message to other museums, but we hope that this first step taken by Sicily can encourage a similar decision in other countries.
Currently, there are plaster copies installed in place of the original elements kept by the British Museum. The officials wish to have the British Museum send back the ancient sculptures.
When there is a will, there is a way. This will happen. Sooner or later it will happen, and we're looking towards constructively engaging with the British Museum to find, again, as I told you, a mutually acceptable solution.
However, the British Museum doesn't confirm any current discussions with the Greek authorities on the return of the marbles. Recently, several European countries have decided to return looted artifacts to their native countries. An example of this is the transfer of certain monuments from France, Spain, and Germany to African countries.
The processes that happened between 1989 and 91 were called by Fukuyama the end of history. That was supposed to be the end of a new liberal world where everything was streamlined and the so far dramatic and flow of history would be eased. It would also seem that the fall of the Soviet Union 30 years back would put an end to a certain period of the colonial subjugation of our part of Europe. However, 30 years later, we can see that no end of history has happened. Also, the issue of the collapse of the Soviet Union has not been fully worked out. Looking at the response of the Russians over the last couple of months and years, we can see longing for the Soviet Union, for the world, which, as per this narrative, the Russian narrative, was a streamlined world where the existence of this hegemony was bringing peace to our region. Russia is taking advantage of the public distrust in Kazakhstan, Belarus, to show why this hegemony is needed. We're losing the most important issue of the collapse, which were raised by Polish historians, the right for self-definition. We are criticizing post-colonialism, but still there's a lot of allowance for some states to predominate over other states, some nations to predominate over other nations. There's disbelief that some nations can define themselves and rule themselves. The idea of our debate is to give the possibility of speaking for themselves, not to the hegemony, but to nations that put their heads up after many years of subjugation and lack of democracy. Today, Georgians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Latvians, Kazakhs, and many other nations that were part of the Soviet Union have the right to speak for their own, the way they wish. And that's the idea of our debate. So to understand the present, we have to take a step backwards. Mateusz Matyszkowicz spoke for a moment ago. My name is Piotr Gociek, and welcome to the special edition of What's Next. Welcome to our viewers of TVP World and all those watching us online. Let me remind you that the totality of this almost 2 hours debate will be available on VOD.pl. Our bridge, television bridge, has been called the Soviet Union a corpse or a phantom 30 years later. The declaration on the dissolution of the Soviet Union was adopted on December 26, 1991, 30 years ago. This decision was preceded by the Biélorussia Concord to replace the USSR with the CIS. During our program, we will take a look at those events and their aftermath, not from the perspective of the empire, rather than that, from the perspective of those who regained their freedom. We will start our trip from the country that has been most vocal over the last couple of months, and where we're discussing at which moment it actually left the Russian sphere of influence, whether it's a process that can be reversed. Let's start with Ukraine. Ukrainians in the hierarchy of USSR were deemed to be the second nation after Russians, and Kiev was deemed to be the second capital after Moscow. However, in 1991, most Ukrainians in their referendum chose independence from the Kremlin. One of the reasons was the crisis, the economic, spiritual crisis. The referendum took place on the 1st of December. The Ukrainian nations, almost by 91%, chose not to belong to the Soviet Union. Over 12 million Ukrainians lost their lives during the period, 6 million during World War II. 5 million during the Holodomor, the Great Famine. And at the same time, they pressed their charges that their nation not only defended their territory, but also expanded it. Just to give an example of Crimea, where Ukrainians were not part of, or the majority of the nation. Khrushchev came to Crimea and said that Russia was not capable of managing Crimea, and Ukraine should take care of that. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Because it was not formed in a natural way. Everybody who lived at that time could hear, you should not go to church if you want to. You should not, when asked the question whether I can write and say what I say don't. The authorities were above the nation. The party power brought a mortal threat to everyone. That's a special edition of the program What's Next? Piotr Gocek, welcome again. Our trip over the post-Soviet nations were started with Ukraine, and our first guest is Professor Yaroslav Hrycak, Ukrainian historian and academic. Welcome, and thank you for taking our invitation. Thank you very much for the invitation. Good evening. Were the Ukrainians anyhow singled out in the Soviet era or privileged anyhow? Quite lately, Viktor Suzorov said that it was not feasible to wage a war between Ukrainians and Russians because they were brothers. Ukrainians had a special status in the Russian Empire. There was quite a lot of Ukrainians in power, and their status was rather high. It was connected with who they were. If they were in power, it was obvious that in the recent years, the Soviet Union was managed by Brezhnev's family from Dnipropetrovsk. Ukrainians played a major role in the Russian Empire, just as the Scots in Great Britain. At the same time, many people did not take that scenario as feasible, and they did not treat Russia as an aggressor. Many Ukrainians thought they should go west. It could be compared to Jews in the Soviet Union. They had a similar position. So the Ukrainian scenario was not written in the stars. Nothing was obvious until the crisis of the Soviet Union happened, among others, the Chernobyl tragedy. Professor, what would be the foundation of Ukraine when they regained independence in 1991? Would it be anti-communism, like the memories of the Great Famine, or the nation-state that was supposed to be reborn in 1918, or the recollection of the Kazakh myth? Well, actually, the historical remembrance of Ukrainians did not exist until the 1980s. That was a conscious trick of the Soviet Union. They wanted to annihilate the remembrance. There were many books about this, and it was obvious that when Brezhnev was coming to Kiev, it was said that the goal of the Soviet policy was to Sovietize Ukraine. Ukrainians did not know about their past. They did not know anything about the Great Famine. They spoke about the Kazakhs, but only in the sense that the Kazakhs brought Ukraine to Russia. So to build Ukraine based on history was almost impossible. Actually, Ukrainians were very pragmatic about it, to flee as soon as possible from the poverty which they had in the Soviet Union. It was like a ticking bomb, and they needed to flee from that threat as far as possible. That was the most important motive for most Ukrainians. perhaps with the exception of Galicinia, where they preserved the historical remembrance. But it was not true for Dnipro or Kiev. So it was a very pragmatic approach. Professor, could you now listen to the words from Mykola Yapchuk, the columnist, who also expressed his opinion for the sake of our program? Please watch it along with. Well, actually, I don't see any major advantages of that Soviet period. There was nothing that would not have been feasible but for the Soviet Union. Well, for instance, if it were possible to maintain an independent Ukraine after 1918, well, who knows? Perhaps it would have been a state that would be quite powerful, at least as developed as Poland today. That couldn't be excluded. Well, the history could have been quite different. So even some developments were not owing to the Soviet Union. It's rather a matter of a global process. It's a matter of the 20th century. You have to remember that Ukraine had a very low starting position during the perestroika period. But in my opinion, under the conditions, difficult conditions, it achieved anything it could have achieved. Now we can speculate that it could have achieved more, that it could grow as much as Poland or Lithuania, but alas, it's not the case. In this country, with this society and the elites that were also very much Sovietized, it would have been difficult to dream of anything else. It has achieved what it has, but it was a very important catalyst of the fall of the Soviet Union. Mykola Yapchuk spoke for our purposes, the Ukrainian essayist and poet, and with us is Professor Yaroslav Grycak from Lviv. Professor, there was no single Ukraine. Is that the reason why the creation of the new identity after 1991 took so long, and only the Maidan sped it up? Because the experiences were very different in Ukraine. You mentioned the Galicinia. Yes and no, because Ukraine achieved its independence and support owing to the pragmatic alliance of three parts. One of them was Western Ukraine, the Galicinia, the old Austrian and Polish territory, which was closer to those nations, and then Kiev, containing elites, especially cultural elites that did not have such independence-related ambitions. And we saw Kravchuk as president, and there was one very important part that we tend to forget. That was the workers' movement in Donbass, that we tend to forget. And those workers decided that it was better to join Kiev rather than Moscow. And that alliance of Galicinia, Kiev, and the mining Donbass made a difference. And they together decided that the percentage of those favoring independence was so high. They say it was a very pragmatic decision. All those who lived in those times decided that an apocalypse was coming, Armageddon was coming, and you have to flee. And that gave an impulse for those three allies to combine their forces. It was an alliance of different actors. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Donbass swapped sides. But it was important to preserve this compromise. Ukraine is still divided. These are different Ukraines. But the Kiev part has to take care of this compromise between those different parts. And the compromise between those elites is a matter of democracy. And this makes Ukraine so different from Russia and Belarus. That's why they say that in Ukraine, someone like Putin or Lukashenko is not feasible, and the two Maidans have also shown it.
lecturer Ukrainian historian, was part of What's Next. And today's bridge continues, and we are going to be on air until 11. This is just the beginning of the journey that we have embarked on. We're going to visit the countries that have decided to free themselves from Soviet domination. We are going to visit the republics that were regaining independence 30 years ago. The collapse of the Soviet Union. What is the Belarusi's perspective? The country where they decided to create a brand new entity. It was a Białowieża agreement that indicated the Commonwealth of Independent States. Belarus used to be called the assembly factory of the Soviet Union. It was one of the wealthiest republics of the Soviet Union. At the time of perestroika, the communist position was uprooted in Minsk too. There were many reasons for that, one of them being the economic crisis and the memory of Afghanistan war, where Belarusians were killed, thousands of soldiers returned, and concealing the truth about Chernobyl, the greatest technical collapse in the history of humanity. It struck lots of locals. There were many lies. When I was a schoolgoer, I was a wonderful student, and I knew the right answer, and I did like that. And then I thought to myself how scary it was to follow the patterns you have to live by. Soviet ideologies believed Belarus, the republic, which embraced communism first. There were huge experiments related to the nation. Stalinists murdered all intellectuals. They killed anybody who believed themselves to be Belarusians. There was the fate irony. Belarus, Uroczysko Wiskola, witnessed in 1999 the signing of Białowieża agreement that put an end to Soviet Union. I was the initiator of Wiskola meeting 20th of October 1991. I invited Yeltsin. And empires do not dissolve without bloodshed. But Soviet Union was the first one to do so. After Soviet Union collapse, the Belarusian powers did not have time to make democracy stronger. This made it possible to get Alexander Lukashenko power in 1994. Today, he imposes Soviet order to the Belarusian state. And as yet another person to sit on the panel on this program on Soviet Union dissolution and the consequences, we have Zenon Pasniak, one of the leaders of Belarus freedom movement. Let us remember that Bielon Pasniak was in opposition in the 1990s, where little did we think about possible Soviet Union dissolution or self-dissolution. We are going to go to Bielsat studio. We've got our guest in. Hello and welcome. Good evening. In Belarus, after dissolution, was it more fear or more joy? More fear of what is going to come? Frankly speaking, when there was this freedom declaration, we all were overwhelmed with happiness. Never ever have we experienced anything like that. Belarus had the chance to witness the process of rebirth. They celebrated the moment, yet at the same time there was a huge part of our society that followed the Soviet Union's illusions. And I need to say that everything was destroyed in Belarus by the Soviet Union. All schools were closed down. It was huge rubble. I remember my students' time. I was being interrogated by the Soviet secret services. They said, Belarus does not exist. It will never exist. It's just a dream of yours. They openly said, that's the end of Belarus. You are not going to regain independence. But they were hugely mistaken. That was a severe mistake that they made. Kuropatty discovery. This discovery was like a nuclear bomb explosion. All the nation was pretty excited to learn the news. That was the onset, the information on what happened near Minsk. More than 200,000 of those who were killed by the Soviet Union. It was the revenge for the whole nation. They believed that was the end of communism. The National Front was created back then. It was the beginning of our fight, of our combat. And this officer who said that Belarus does not exist, that was a dream, that was a shock for them. They were pretty frustrated. History contains elements that are difficult to foresee. Yes, there are windows of opportunity, and you need to utilize them. The moment that Zenon Paznik was speaking about seemed to trigger the development of Belarus identity, that they would advance pretty fast. But reality is as it is. You follow the press, you know what is the situation in Belarus. I requested Agnieszka Romaszewska-Guzy, the head of Bielsat TV station. The image of Soviet Union as a superpower is to staunch your own nation. Speaking about Belarus, the changes are related to internal disintegration. They want to believe that Russia is weak enough not to be able to control what they have gained, or in a positive sense. However, we have few analysts who believe that this may happen. But what may happen, nobody actually knows or may foresee. We need to wait for this to happen. And there is the second condition, internal changes in Belarus. With today's people in power, this cannot happen. Should the people in power change, and this is related to Russia's concern, should be triggered by the determination of the local people. We could see how important that was. The country is not big. The country is some kind of pushed between Russia and the rest of the world. But still, the local society is pretty determined, and this is a pivotal element, because you cannot control the society that is against. It was Agnieszka Guzy speaking, the head of Bielsat television station. Zenon Paznik was speaking about what was happening in 1991 and in the following years. Agnieszka Romaszewska-Guzy was speaking about the present-day situation in Belarus. So I'm returning to Mr. Zenon Paznik, who is in Bielsat TV studio. The question is, why have they decided to make a U-turn, no longer wanted to be independent of Russia? And when was the moment they learned that it was the wrong direction that they have assumed, that Russia is regaining its power again? Belarus was pretty much destroyed. It was rubble, and they needed some time to recover, at least 5 years. It was less than 3 years. So people had this Soviet awareness. Little did they understand what was the role of Russia, what independence means. In 1994, Moscow turned out to be the winner, because it had this privileged position owing to the fact that the nation did not understand the situation. It was a pretty difficult time, economy-wise. The worst thing was not the fact that Moscow made the decision. It is not what it used to be. Without any doubts, it is, as you are saying. One more interesting thing. You witnessed something few people remember about. Hardly any people know it. Other republics, Asiatic ones, did not want to leave Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan. They were pretty scared at signing this Białowieża agreement. Kazakhstan opposed that pretty strong. Why was that? I need to give you some background. I was visiting Almaty on a business trip. Once this treaty was signed, Gorbachev said it out loud. It does not mean that Soviet Union collapses. There are still 9 republics. He initiated a new form of Soviet Union, which was a serious threat. Nazarbayev supported Gorbachev. Gorbachev said you'd be the prime minister in the Soviet Union, and it was 2 months struggle to keep up these republics. And Yeltsin was the winner in this struggle. On the 14th of December, Nazarbayev proclaimed Kazakhstan's independence. On the 21st of December, we visited Almaty to have an agreement with these republics, to discuss it, so that they would support Yeltsin. They would not support the idea of giving rebirth to the Soviet Union. I was the opposition representative. There was Shushkevich, Kravchuk, Kievich, Yeltsin. The discussions continued for a few days. It was a pretty tough time. On the 21st of December, the Asiatic republics supported Yeltsin. On the 25th of December, Gorbachev gave up his office. On the 26th, the Republic's Council in the Supreme Council of the Soviet Union proclaimed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Thank you very much for these recollections, because it shows how close we were to a different unveiling of the story. Senin Paznik, the oppositionist of 1990s, yet another guest of the special What's Next program, straight from Bielsa television. Thank you very much for your intervention. And now we are going to go to Vilnius TVP studio. It was quite a dramatic unveiling of the story. We are going to make some recollections, and we are going to see Professor Vytautas Landsbergis, who was the president of the country starting 1991.
Lithuania
was the first Soviet Union country that proclaimed independence on the 11th of March 1990. The then Supreme Council held the meeting in this very room. Lithuanian Republic was transformed into an independent state. It regained the traditional symbols of the country. Moscow was fighting for returning its own order, and on the 12th and the 13th of January 1991, we saw dramatic unveiling of a situation. Lithuania defended its independence and triggered a fast and efficient collapse of Soviet Union. We are in the studio to remember what happened in January 1991, what were the consequences, and what is our perception of the incidents back then. Algirdas Saudargas, the first foreign minister of independent Lithuania, one of the signatories of this proclamation, is our guest.
You were the one to sign the Act of Independence in this very room. What were the emotions like back then? Well, the emotions were indeed quite elevated, huge. Oh, to remember that makes your heart melt. It's always very emotional to come back to this room, because this room is no longer being used by the Lithuanian parliament, the same as special occasions like today, like tonight, exactly. And back then, it was a moment when indeed it was the Lithuanian Republic restored, not back from the Soviet Republic, it was from the pre-war period. Yes, Mr. Minister, but for what you're saying, that few countries rejoiced Lithuanian independence. They watched it with concern and asked it whether you actually wanted that. I think there's two matters to be touched upon. The first one is that indeed independent Lithuania was not needed, shall I say, because the international situation was complex. It was a matter of the German reunification, very pivotal and very important. Exactly. Everybody was concerned that somehow Gorbachev or the next person to replace him in the Soviet Union. Well, everybody hoped for a Gorbachev, and Lithuania was like stepping in the way. We could feel it, we could sense it. And after that event, that act, which was official, and then our policy was very cautious. We were open to any talks and negotiations, as long as we didn't change the decision. And secondly, well, we might say that there was hope that you might not want independence. I remember after January 1991, I was in Poland, then I went to Brussels, to London, and then visited Germany. I was hosted by the then Chancellor, no, not the Chancellor, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Genscher, and he asked me whether, do you really want to have full independence? My response was, Mr. Minister, it's not a matter of whether you want it or not. I've been elected. That's what the nation wants. That's an obligation. And was the 13th of January necessary? Because Gorbachev promised he wouldn't resort to violence, and yet violence was applied. Well, first of all, we did not know about that agreement. Now we are aware of it. On the other hand, it was very important, because that stopped the Soviet Union and Gorbachev. We could say Gorbachev failed to meet that promise, to fulfill it. So No continuation happened, but in September of the same year, after the Moscow putsch, the riots, well, it turned out that Lithuanian independence was defended. Tonight we're remembering the events that happened in Vilnius on January 13th, but the path towards independence started way before. It was Sąjūdis. It was the act of independence. And the next essay is talking about the awakening of Lithuania. The January events of 1991 were the peak of Lithuania's way towards independence. It started with a perestroika. Based on this, Sąjūdis was formed, enjoying a growing social support, where Lithuania was asking for more freedoms and liberties, and it passed the Act of Independence. It came as a surprise to Moscow, and they started applying political and economic blackmail. And we can remember the difficult months of 1990 and 91, when everything was growing more expensive. There were no goods in stores, and the residents were very dissatisfied. Moscow did not stop at the economic blockage. At the beginning of 91, Gorbachev applied an ultimatum to Lithuania, demanding the restoration of the Soviet rule, and tanks drove into streets, and they tried to take over the television station. On the 12th and 13th of January, there was a storm in which 14 civilians died and several people were injured, and some people were Richard Stubitskas was tortured at the police station. They said we were terrorists and we knew where minefields were. For the next couple of years, the focus of public attention was on Lithuania. At that time, we talked to President Vytautas Landsbergis that we had to think about forming a government in exile to manage the actions of Lithuanian citizens, to show that Lithuania was not thwarted. A large support was given by Poland. We were preparing for Lithuania's functioning in a situation similar to martial law in Poland. The attack on the Seimas never happened. In the referendum, a vast majority of residents favored independence. Yanayev's putsch put an end of the Soviet rule in Lithuania. One of the key people of the Lithuanian independence was Professor Vytautas Landsbergis, the head of the Lithuanian Restoration Parliament, who agreed to provide some analysis of those events to our rapporteur, Aldona Polska. The first head of the reborn Lithuania and the witness of the bloody events of January 13th, 14th, 1991. Professor, prayer and song was the only weapon that the residents came to this building to defend it. What was the weapon that they presented, that those inside the Seimas building was applied? Well, actually, my only weapon was a telephone. We tried to call Western capitals. Well, the results could be different, but we also made a phone call to Warsaw because we talked to Mr. Okinczyk, but also at the Polish parliament, next to him was also our foreign minister, Saudargas, and we made a decision that in a situation where our independent government should be dissolved or abolished in Vilnius, we would form a government in exile. And aside from that phone call, did you have any weapon here? Well, to a very minimum extent. But our protection was provided by people, lots of people, who came to stand by us and protect us with their bodies and to make a living shield for their independent government. And that weapon turned out to be indefatigable. They never stepped back. When the enemy expected that after firing and the first victims, everybody would spread out, well, that didn't happen. There was a tunnel dug from the Seimas building to the Vilia river. Did you see that tunnel? No. I heard the proposal of seeing that. I never went there. I knew there was something like this. And so that the last defenders of the buildings, given an attack from the Soviet troops, could somehow, after defending the building, they could possibly have an opportunity of leaving that building. There was this tunnel. And they had some weak means to protest. Well, there would probably have been used, and there would have been also Soviet victims. We were in a state of an offensive war from the Soviet Union. They started an undeclared war against the Lithuanian Republic. Thank you very much, Professor, for your remembrance, for your memories and reflections. Over to you, Edita. Thank you very much, Aldona. Back to our conversation. You were given a mandate to form a government in exile. What were your first actions? Who could you hope for? First of all, I was the decision of the Lithuanian government. I think of the 11th in the evening, there was a government meeting, and the situation was quite tense. And every minister had to take some action. And, well, everybody said, so what are you doing here? You should go abroad. But first you went to Poland. I first went to visit President Landsbergis. I spoke to them, told them the government were sending me out. He also signed a document to me, and then I went to Poland. And those powers of attorney were only sent to me after the night of January 13th, because then a decision was made that if the government was not able to fulfill its functions, someone had to represent it. So that what happened. That happened in Poland. In Poland, I received that document from the government, the powers of attorney to form the government in exile. And at the TV tower, where the most important events, most dramatic events happened, we have our colleague Ryszard Wildkiewicz next to him. Hello.
So, this has been the symbol of Lithuanian citizens' fight for the freedom of their country. Yes, on the 13th of January, this is the place where people assemble in order to pay tribute to those who sacrificed their life to the freedom of the country. And with me there is Krystyna Adamovich, many-year deputy editor-in-chief of Vilnius Courier. Krystyna, that was quite a difficult time. Everybody had to decide which party they want to belong to. So Poles had the right to doubt. Yes, Poles were not ready to take up the new policy, the new order. They were afraid that their identity would be tarnished. It was one of the most important things at that time. Why? Because back then, when Sąjūdis was pretty strong in Lithuania, there were many assemblies of the people, and Poles were afraid that Lithuania would be for Lithuanians only, that Polish schools would have to be reorganized. We were afraid of this unveiling. And then there was a period when we had to have our say and stop sitting on the fence and say which part we want to belong to and face up to the task. So the journalists were quite united because Soviet troops were taking over all the editorial teams. Yes, there was the press house that was the focal point for all editorial teams, and the soldiers stepped in first. It was a regular working day. It was in the broad light. They came into every office in the building. It was quite quick. They wielded Kalashnikovs, and it was horrible because they drove us out of the building. So we were pretty surprised. Little did we know what to do. After 2 p.m., somebody called me up. They informed me that Respublika, the newly created newspaper, invited all editorial teams to write articles and join in to describe the situation. I wrote an article in Polish, and it is the manifestation of Poles joining in. Krystyna, with a hindsight, when you look back, what happened 30 years ago, was it worth it? Was it worth to shed blood? Yes. We live in an independent state now. We are the citizens of Lithuania. And for us, we find this a homeland, an independent state. We do respect this country, and the country is respected in Europe, which makes us really happy. We are happy to be the citizens of Lithuania. Thank you very much, Krystyna. Over to you, Edita. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, Krystyna Adamovich. Minister, Vytautas Landsbergis, our reporter, had a chance to talk to. In 1991, Moscow declared war on Lithuania, and this war continues. There's never been an end to this war. Do you agree with this saying? Now? I don't know. Well, we're speaking in the context of what happened in Kazakhstan. It's a metaphor for Lithuania. Let's think it this way. How about Russia? For the political status of Russia, or mental state of Russia, one might say, what the nation may think in Russia, they find it true. There was the 10-year period when President Yeltsin was in the office, and we can say that it was a war. We cannot not say it was a wartime between Lithuania and Russia, and everything returned after that period. Yeltsin did that, I believe. In Soviet Union, how to put it, it was the end of Bolshevism. The party was over. It was no longer a ruling party. And the Bolshevik Party, or the Communist Party, as you call it at the Soviet Union times, What did they create? They created the secret services, KGB. How to put it in Polish? Yeah, they created structures and units. And KGB was the ruling unit, and they are in power now. So, Minister, Lithuania, can it set the pattern of fighting for freedom for other countries that might try to regain independence? I think that today we are a fully fledged country. We follow the spirit that we coined up back then. We look at Ukraine, we look at the processes in that country, we can see that they are going down our way, although in a different form. We can find many similarities. So in this sense, we need to work on our own. We need to set an example for them. So we need to set an example that befits our times. So Lithuania is an example for other countries. Yeah, and Poland was an example for Lithuania. We were looking at solidarity. We were looking at the times of the martial law. And we were looking at what's happening after that, at this combat or fight. That was an example for Lithuania. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much. Over to the studio. We were in the same house of Lithuania that witnessed the Freedom Act signing in 1991. Thank you very much indeed, TVP Vilnius. It is a special What's Next program. Soviet Union, a dead body or a phantom 30 years after. Lithuania proclaimed independence first, but it was not the only state. Baltic states were the leaders because Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia were the first to leave the Soviet Union. And now let's talk about Latvia. We started with history. Now we speak about the present day. Now we are going to start with present day. We are going to have Jānis Kārisons, the Secretary of State in the Ministry of Defense of Latvia. NATO membership offers the opportunity to create our country. It is a very important aspect of our stateship. From a historic perspective, when you have no allies, when you are left to your own device, it is pretty difficult to keep up your independence and freedom. That was the case in 1940, when we were taken over and occupied by the Soviet Union. And I believe that our country neighboring with the Soviet Union brings different consequences. We can see the positive aspects when we compare to what happens in previous with other post-Soviet countries like Georgia or Belarus that keep fighting for the development. The imperial ambitions of Russia are on the increase. There are more and more challenges for independence of these countries. And the second aspect is that you need to be ready to fight for your country. You need to be ready for all kinds of surprises that may come. On the one hand, this is a defensive action. On the other hand, you need to be brought together and resistant to pressure from the outside. This is good for our society in the peacetime because it will be more resistant to all kinds of challenges like information, disinformation, cyber attacks that we are opposing at the moment. Jānis Kārisons, Secretary of State in the Ministry of Defense of Latvia, was speaking to us. What we might say is the fact that the processes that we have been observing, the regaining independence from Soviet Union, the processes were quite similar. There were three stages, we might say, and we might observe the latest stage. First, you leave the Soviet Union structure. Second of all, ladies and gentlemen, is when you have to overcome internal problems. Not always was it feasible. In Belarus, the processes were reversed. What is happening at the moment, imperial ambitions of the Soviet Union, is the third stage of this journey when you coin up the identity. So let's talk to yet another person, Dagmara Bejner-Legara, Deputy Speaker of the Parliament Sociologists. It's been 30 years for our country's society to gain new identity. I belong to this generation that remembers the collapse of the Soviet Union. It all started with John Paul II, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher having their say. It was a key, important moment for the deconstruction of the Soviet Union. Little do we remember about them. At the end of the Soviet Union times, it was December 1991, Latvia was declared an independent state. Regaining independence, 4th of May 1990. Full independence, 27th August 1991. In September, we were authorized an independent state. We believe this a profound historic process. Never did we accept Russia occupying us. We keep up our narrative. We were an occupied country that wanted to regain independence. And another foreign guest in this special program. We are speaking about Soviet Union the collapse 30 years after. It was sociologists and the Speaker of the Parliament, and we were provided the recordings from RETV, so we'd like to express our gratitude for your help and assistance. We are going to have a guest with whom we are going to talk to. I'll have the pleasure of talking to our guest on your behalf. This will be Andris Spruts, political scientist, historian, head of Latvian Institute of International Affairs. Stay with us. We are saying goodbye to TV Polonia viewers. TVP World, TVP Culture, TVP Vilnius, TVP Polonia Culture are staying with us. This is the special program of What's Next. Piotr Gociek. This is the debate, the international bridge. We are speaking about the Soviet Union collapse. Is this a dead body or a phantom? We have had a chance to look into Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus. And now we are going to speak about Latvia's present day and future. We have Andris Spruts, a historian, political scientist, head of Latvian Institute of International Affairs. Good evening, sir. Over to Riga. Good evening. As the result of 1991 referendum, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia declared independence. There was bloodshed in Lithuania. This is what we discussed a few moments ago. Few people remember that Moscow introduced economic sanctions that were targeted at rebellious republics. How close was it to staunch this revolution to regain independence in the Baltic states? It was 1991. Lithuania declared independence. Latvia had a referendum at that time too. We could feel the pressure, and the pressure was pretty distinct. We wanted to become independent. We were craving for independence. We wanted to justify our independence, although they wanted to exert economic pressure. In Riga, there was a bloodshed too in January. There were barricades in Riga. This continued for 2 weeks. I myself was a part of that. They tried to staunch this independence or these attempts to regain independence. They employed military forces to do so. In 1991, the parliament accepted the resolution that only the citizens who used to live in its area before annexation to the Soviet Union could get citizenship and rights. So what were the relations between the locals and Russian minority? It was a problem of all post-Soviet republics.
Yes, it was a problem. I used to be a challenge, and partially that's the aftermath that we have to cope with to date because of the Soviet occupation. And many people came to live to Latvia who were Russian-speaking residents. Before the war, almost 80% of the people were Latvian speakers, and therefore that was an issue of how to ensure survival for the language and the culture. And therefore, in 1991, it was a very controversial decision regarding the citizenship. Giving citizenship only to those citizens who lived there before the occupation and to their children. And many Soviet citizens had to go through the naturalization process. And despite that, despite the passage of time, the majority of people assumed or accepted the citizenship. However, there are still part of people who don't have Latvian citizenship, and most of them are Russian-speaking residents. And that was a challenge right off, and this is still the aftermath of the occupation, which is something that we have to cope with. Well, that's another example of how history is impacting the presidents. Thank you very much for that, and let me remind you that Andrzej Spruds, historian, political scientist, director of the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, was our guest from Riga. Thank you very much for being with us. And at this moment, let me remind you of a very pivotal coincidence, because before the Soviet Union was dissolved, before all those events happened, before the bloodshed in Riga or in Vilnius at the TV tower, before the Belarus Accord, what happened was the Autumn of Nations was 1989. And then huge changes affected Central Europe. The consequences of the Autumn of Nations of 1989 shook the world. They brought a new vision of politics, consisting of the discovery of civic involvement. The upturns in Central Europe, especially in Poland, brought changes to the old order of the world. Owing to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the historical cycle was to come to an end, started by World War I, and the assumption of power by the Bolsheviks in October 1917, as well as the long European ideological war. In historians' view, many ideological, social, economic factors brought the collapse of the Soviet Union. You could mention the policy of glasnost, the deep economic crisis, and the collapse of faith of political elites into the need and feasibility of keeping the Soviet Union. Those processes also expedited the new movements, which put an end to that world and brought forward the new world no longer bifocal. This put an end of the political dictatorship. As the American ideal historian says, the Autumn of Nations had more than one reason, but they put also a new program, not only for post-communist societies, but also for Western democracies. And in tonight's program, I'm inviting my new guest, Alexander Gubrinovich, specialist in international law, and Dr. Paweł Ukielski, historian, political scientist, and the deputy director of the Warsaw Rising Museum. Good evening. Let me also remind you that along with Adam Burakowski, you're the co-authors of the book 1989, The Autumn of Nations. The collapse of the wall, I'm looking at different scenarios that took place in Central Europe. That was the collapse of the Berlin Wall. That was the Accord in Poland, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. We had a bloody revolt in Romania. It was all observed meticulously from Russia. And can you say that the way of dissolving the Soviet Union was the aftermath of all those scenarios? Alexander Gubrinovich. Well, it's hard to say. The situation in the Soviet Union was slightly different. It was a state that was very much centralized, even though the particular republics enjoyed a different status. It was obvious that everything was decided by Moscow. I would put it the following way. I'm not quite certain whether it was all that meticulously observed in Moscow. The truth is that whatever was happening in Central and Eastern Europe, to some extent, definitely, but we have to remember that as per the documents that we have on our desks, we know that when we're talking about 1989, Moscow was already occupied with itself. They were actually interested not so much in what was happening in Central and Eastern Europe. Well, that was the perhaps as of secondary importance, but what was most important was to save the Soviet Union. You're asking whether they drew some conclusions from the events. Well, it's hard to say, because Gorbachev, who was putting an air of a liberal and frontman of perestroika, and when those things happened, he tried to resort to power, and in Vilnius, blood was shed. So I would put it this way, that the Soviet Union did not draw the right conclusion from what was happening in Central and Eastern Europe, because actually no round table was proposed. Actually, under the pressure of economic, social processes, last but not least political processes, it imploded and collapsed. But that's an opinion that would actually bring us to a very radical conclusion, that actually the Autumn of Nations did not impact significantly what was happening in the Soviet Union. I'm just wondering whether Dr. Paweł Ukielski shares that opinion, our next guest. Well, if we were to think who drew most conclusions from what was happening in Central Europe, we might come to a paradoxical conclusion that the opposition drew more conclusions, and the national movements, which realized in 1989 that they could afford much more, that the Soviet Union was weak enough So much so that its leadership did not send tanks to the streets of Budapest as in 1956 or to the streets of Prague as they did in 1968. That meant that the nationalist movements started presenting their expectations in a clear way, alluding to what happened in Central European states. Actually, as you take a look at the sequence of events mentioned in our program, you can see that the expectations and demands starting from 1989 through 1991 were radicalized. The first declaration of independence in the Soviet Union happened in 1990 after the Autumn of Nations. So I would propose an even bolder thesis that whereas Gorbachev was not capable to draw conclusions from that lesson, because you could say that he was actually pushing the toughest leaders. He was not capable of responding to that later on, and those who wanted independence, first a greater autonomy, and at the end of the day they declared independence, learned much more from that, and they drew the right conclusions, and they brought it along with the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So perhaps those who struggled in Central Europe overestimated the power of the Soviet Union, since they were not capable of responding in 89. They were occupied with their own problems, and perhaps the renewal of the Soviet Union, that meant that perhaps after the fall of 1989, they could have presented much more far-reaching demands in Central Europe. How would you comment on that, Alexander Gubrinovich? I would probably favor that conclusion. The question is only about which radical conclusions we meant. If we're talking about the evacuation of the Red Army from our borders, well, probably so. We wouldn't have had to wait until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The evacuation of the Red Army from the territories of Central and Eastern European states, well, probably the Soviets were also prone to go in that direction. Poland was probably one of the last nations whose territory was left by the Soviet army. The question is whether he could have proposed a request to join the NATO. Probably not because the Soviet Union would have opposed that. It was the question of the counterparty. Well, the NATO was probably not prepared for that. The American politicians were very much afraid of what was happening in our part of Europe. And the same question to Dr. Ukielski. What else could have been achieved? Well, from today's perspective, you could see that a lot of things could have been sped up. We're actually drawing the same conclusions in our book, where we can see the sequence that those countries that started off later were capable of pursuing their reforms much quicker, because each next nation saw they were able to achieve it quicker. That's why Hungary or Czech Republic applied for NATO membership much quicker than Poland. And another thing is that the West tried to play down the moods in Central Europe. It was no longer the America of Ronald Reagan. You often forget it. We tend to forget it, that that America was much more cautious, let alone Germany, that was much more cautious about such things. So the concern about the possible responses from the Soviet Union, which, as it turned out later, were not feasible realistically, predominated not only among the opposition assuming power in Central Europe, but also and especially probably in the West. The West tried to play down the expectations, far-reaching expectations of the opposition leaders. Thank you very much. And the next guests of our program were Dr. Alexander Gubrinovich and Dr. Paweł Ukielski, the Deputy Director of the Warsaw Rising Museum, co-authors of the book 1989, The Autumn of Nations. Thank you very much for your participation in our discussion.
And we are getting back to the Baltic states. We learned a lot about the Declaration of Independence. What we are going to do now is to have a look at the situation 30 years later. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia regained independence. It was back in 1991, and they returned was in between war period. However, the presence of Russia's army ended in 1998 with the last outpost was closed. It was Skrunda radio station in Latvia. However, Moscow did not give up on their attempts to influence safety, security and foreign affairs of previous states. They refused to sign declarations on borders. It made it difficult for the states to join EU and the NATO. Today, the three Baltic states are a very nice place to have a trade with the European Union, despite the fact that Russia has been developing their own infrastructure. And although they do not want to close the borders, you can hear the opinions that the Baltic states would like to have a distance between Russia and Western states with some ties of cooperation. According to the expert, this healthy involvement may potentially stimulate the development of neighboring areas that need to be supported when giving up on depressions, still keeping independence and peace in the relations between Baltic states and Russia. There is the special What's Next program that focuses on what's happening 30 years after and what are the consequences for today's presence of CE countries. Soviet Union, is it a cadaver or a phantom 30 years later? And we have more foreign guests. Dr. Adas Jakubauskas, historian and lecturer of Vilnius University, and Andrei Makarychev, political studies expert in Tartu University, and Monika Makalichin, the ambassador in Latvia. I hope she'll be joining us in a few minutes. Good evening to you, gentlemen. And the first question goes to Dr. Adas Jakubauskas. What is happening? The migration crisis, the escalation of Russia's demand, how does it support the identity of Baltic states and stronger ties with the Western countries? Beyond any doubts, the Baltic states need to pull their forces together. Russia's aggression need to be opposed together. We saw the onset of the crisis on the borders with Poland, Latvia and Lithuania. It was triggered by Alexander Lukashenko's regime. However, the people who entrusted him with the power made it for the people to come to Belarus who tried to cross the borders with the aforementioned countries. Lithuania was quite gentle with regards to these people and the situation as we are facing at the moment, one might say. With regards to the situation in our country and the neighboring countries. Question to Andrei Makarychev. Has Russia reconciled with the fact that the Baltic states are independent? It's a strange question. It's been 30 years. But a few minutes ago, Professor Vytautas Landsbergis said that he had the feeling that this war continues. It was the war declared 30 years ago by the Soviet Union, and there is no end to this war at the moment. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this debate. It's a clear question. On the one hand, Russia has not reconciled with this fact. These countries joined the European Union and NATO. They are no longer impacted by Russia. But this is a more complex question. We have a clear message from Moscow. We know that Russia wants to impact these areas. The intention is a bit unclear. How shall I say it? There are some chances for Moscow to intervene in the areas. But Russia may play a very important role, also in other aspects. The two countries, Latvia and Estonia, are the home for great Russian minorities. And the treaties have not been fully ratified yet. Moscow's propensity to treat these legal regulations between the countries is quite obvious. It was Andrzej Makrejci speaking about the situation. He's the Tartu University lecturer. Thank you very much for your intervention. We had Adas Jakubakas a moment ago, and the question goes to yet another guest. With us, we have Monika Michalishin, who is the Republic of Poland's ambassador to Latvia. Good evening, Madam Ambassador. Can you hear me, Madam? 460 years of relations between Poland and Latvia are going to be celebrated. It was 1561 when we had the onset of these relations. So what is going to happen? How are we going to celebrate this anniversary? We hope that much will be happening. And let's hope that the pandemic will not thwart our plans. We hope that we will remember this very important fact that brings the histories of our countries together. In the context of the debate that we have been facing here, the program, the TV program that we've been a part of, we might say it was the first document that strengthened our collaboration and the eastern flank, because it was the Russians' army that threatened the country. So the then head of the country entrusted Livonia to the Republic of Poland, being afraid of Ivan the Terrible. So I believe that on the one hand, this is a pretty positive moment that we need to remember, that brings Poles and Latvians together. On the other hand, we feel sorry about this because not much has happened over the centuries, and we are facing the same threats. You recollected even the terrible aggression, so it's a historical déjà vu. It was Monika Michalishin, the ambassador of the Republic of Poland to Latvia. It was yet another ghost of this special What's Next program. Baltic states, Ukraine and Belarus. We were speaking about the past in these countries. We were making recollections of what was happening back in 1990-91. How about the present-day situation in relations with Russia? It's a pretty interesting question that we want to refer to. 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine and Belarus were in the same place as this story started. Now they are in different places, so we are going to think why this has happened this way. Ukraine, economic, cultural ties are deep and connects with Russia. It was one of the most populous Russian Soviet Union republics. It had the most of defense industry, agriculture and army, including Black Sea Fleet and military potentials of the Soviet Union. The ties were broken in 1991. This was a strong hit to the superpower. For the 3 decades, the country has gone down its own way, being an independent state, trying to collaborate with Western countries' institutions. Now, more well-informed population of Western Ukraine supports integration with the European Union. However, the eastern borders are for closer ties with Russia. The country is still being the biggest recipient of Russia's gas. It's a transit point to Western Europe. Ukraine became the war of theatre with the annexation of Crimea, and separatists supported in Donbass, in the eastern part of the country. The first decades of independence looked differently in Belarus. Its identity is much weaker. It's more pro-Russian. Lukashenko turned out to be the biggest promoter of Russia's business in this country. Internal crisis after the falsified elections in 2020 weakened the Minsk regime and put Moscow in a very favorable situation, strengthening its influence in Belarus. So we are going to look at the consequences of the changes. We might wonder about international politics and policies, but also about the spirit of inhabitants of what used to be the Soviet Empire, because the spirit is the key question for us to understand what is happening in this part of the world. I believe that what is most interesting, the most important analyst is Sergei Lebedev, the writer who uses literature for this purpose. So we requested him to share his observations, to speak about the heritage of the Soviet Union, something that is still alive in today's Russia. We used to live in Soviet Union. We do remember that Soviet Union was a communist country based on the ideology. The key word for the Soviet Union was communism. What we can see in today's Russia has nothing to do with communism. And in this sense, Soviet Union leaders like Brezhnev, when we look at today's ideology, would have believed this to be anti-Soviet. If in any sense we give a rebirth to anything, is the pre-Soviet empire. In a sense, it is revived. However, Russia is pretty nostalgic for the Soviet Union. It's a kind of resentment that has been based on the idea that we used to have a strong country, that we were listened to, that we were respected by everybody. It remains a fact that today's Russia has no vision of the future. Future as a category, future as a notion does not exist in any sense. Today's Russia looks over the shoulder. Any justification, any imagination of what we are, where we come from, is tapped into the past. In this sense, Soviet Union is the source of inspirations and myths and images that support today's authorities of Russia to be totalitarian. Soviet is not an idea, it's not dogma. It's something much more flexible and fluid, nostalgic, ideological, the golden age that we all remember. And on top of that, there are personal attitudes. Soviet person does not enter an open conflict with the state, first and foremost. 70 years of existence of Soviet Union taught the strategy strategy to evade grey zones, guerrilla movements. Open conflict, open representation of your own interests is still impossible in Russia. For the 30 years we have had since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have experienced a number of dramatic moments. People should have had their say. It was Sergei Lebedev, wonderful Russian writer, the author of wonderful books. And with me, we've got yet another guest, Dr. Paweł Usop, Belarusian political scientist and analyst. The nostalgic, how lively it is, this myth of Soviet Union, this belonging to this huge country that everybody respects, how lively it is outside Russia in what used to be republics.
Well, if we speak about Belarus, I think it's the only nation where this nostalgia has functioning, and based on that wave of nostalgia, Lukashenko came to power and he started to restore the Soviet Union in a separate state. He partially succeeded, also owing to the support from Russia, as opposed to Belarus and other post-Soviet states. They went very far in building their own national identities, sovereignties, and none of the post-Soviet states is at such risks in terms of sovereignty and independence as Belarus is, because Lukashenko, in restoring that nostalgia and building his regime based on the symbols and culture of the Soviet Union, has also tried integrating Belarus with Russia as Soviet Union 2.0. And now the situation is that the processes are coming close to the situation that a curtailed form of the Soviet Union might arise if other states, for instance, Asian states, should join, especially after the recent events, perhaps Kazakhstan. But recently we've been able to see that the generations change in Belarus. A new modern generation has grown up, which is more nation-oriented, and this was expressed in the 2020 events. Are today's authorities treating the restoration of the control of Ukraine and controlling Belarus as key to Russia's approach? Well, actually, as you look at the modern concept of Euro-Asiatism from Russia, it states that without Belarus and Ukraine, there is no greater Russia. That's why it's important for Russia, not only for strategic reasons, geopolitical reasons, to control those areas of Belarus and Ukraine, but also because of their own identity, because increasingly Russia is returning to the tri-identity of the great nation composed of Russians, Belarusians, and Belarusians and Ukrainians, and actually the elimination of one of those nations means a collapse of that greater Russian nation. That's why it's so important, and Russia has been trying to restore not only its influence, but also to create the so-called Russian world within the territories of those states, and it has partially succeeded. Thank you very much for what you said. Paweł Usop, the Belarusian political scientist and analyst, has been our guest. Thank you very much for your visit to our nation. And we're looking at Kazakhstan, the nation you just mentioned, the bloodiest events after 1989 started this year, starting with the riots against the increases in natural gas prices. Kazakhstan is one of the most important Russia's allies in the post-Soviet area. So far, very stable and peaceful. Since the beginning of January, it has been experiencing violent riots after the gas price increases. droves of people took to the streets. The anti-governmental riots or protests were transformed into most violent riots experienced by the country. People also took to the streets of Almaty, the former capital, and intervention troops were sent from other nations, including Russia. Almost 8,000 people were apprehended countrywide. In the president's declaration, it was mentioned that the situation has been stabilized and the troops are protecting strategic facilities. There is a curfew and martial law declared in the country. And with us is the next guest, Jerzy Rożinski. Welcome. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. Pavel Usow has just mentioned that it was key for Russia to maintain Belarus and Ukraine in its sphere of influences. But I remember that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he spoke about his concept of dropping the unnecessary ballast and the focusing on Russia's land, he also mentioned the focus on a larger part of Kazakhstan. Is Russia still perceiving that country in this way? Well, to some extent, most probably so. We have to remind you of the concept of the so-called Russian world, the Ruski Mir, that Vladimir Putin is sometimes speaking about, and the Kremlin elites. We have to remember that Kazakhstan is a multi-ethnic country inhabited by almost 130 nationalities. One of them, being quite significant, is the Russian population inhabiting the north of the country, and hence the thesis or presumption that Kazakhstan constitutes part of the Russian world. How do other inhabitants of Kazakhstan perceive it? I assume that not everybody agrees with that concept. Let me ask this. Well, obviously not. Kazakhstan, if we take a look at the most recent 30 years, has been implementing gradually, without provoking another nation, has been implementing the National Restoration Program, manifesting itself in many aspects. For instance, in terms of publishing many books about the history of the Kazakhs, but also in the governmental program consisting in repatriating Kazakhs from Xinjiang, from China. And that's a very special program because those Kazakhs who dwell in the Chinese territories are mostly children of descendants of those who fled the famine in Kazakhstan. The Great Famine in Ukraine was mentioned in our program, but the famine in Kazakhstan was even greater, and it claimed an even greater number of casualties. And many of them were nomads. So the nationality proportions were upset, and right now those Kazakhs who are being repatriated into the country are bringing a new ethics. They were not Russified. They preserve their culture, the Arabic alphabet, and they stick to their tradition, which is transforming the country's landscape to a large extent, especially that they're being promoted to the local administration. That's a hugely interesting process that is not being mentioned in Poland all that much, and I'm happy that you should have mentioned that. I'm just curious whether what's happening in Kazakhstan will put an end to this process. Jerzy Rohodziński from the Witold Pilecki Institute of Solidarity and Valor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for those almost 2 hours spent together with us. The special edition Soviet Union, a corpse or a phantom of the Soviet Union 30 years later. The whole debate can be watched on VOD. Piotr Gocek, thank you and good night.